All right, let's get into our conversation here on The Explainer tonight. Tonight, we're seeking to understand the budget 2024-2025. What is in it? What are the cuts? What are the expenditures? And what have been the areas of priority that have been considered in the making of this document that will guide the country's budget for the next financial year? Ndindi Nyoro from the Budget and Appropriations Committee joins us. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you very much, Yvonne.
And Dr. Abraham Rugo from IBP Kenya, that's the International Budget Partnerships Kenya. Honorable Ndindi, let's begin with you, the rationale of the budget. So if we can just run our viewers very quickly through it. It was the total budget is now at 3.9 trillion shillings. This is a reduction from the figures that we had seen that had been provided earlier by about 267 billion. It was about 4.188 trillion, so slashed by that. But when you take a look at these figures, the debt repayment takes up a big chunk, which is 1.85 trillion shillings. And out of that, the recurrent expenditure will be 2.78 trillion. When you take a look at the development expenditure, that takes a hit at 687.6 billion shillings. This is just a general overview. We'll get into the rest of the numbers here in just a moment. But just when we take a look at that and the reduction of that, or the revision downwards by close to 300 billion shillings, Honorable Nyoro, explain to us the rationale of the budget and the reduction, at least we have seen, as we get on to budget reading day.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, again, and thank you even for having us with Dr. Rugo. We went to the same university, though he was ahead of me. I hope he didn't take all the knowledge and ran away with it.
We shall see.
The budget-making process is usually highlighted around this time, but the process starts way earlier. We started the budget-making process for now the financial year 24-25 around November last year. And then another huge event around the same period is when we make the budget policy statement. Budget policy statement now sets the ceilings for the various MDAs and programs. Now, around that time, the budget that we made, budget policy statement, the ceilings, was around 4.188 trillion Kenya shillings. And as you rightfully put it, the current budget now we are considering, which are still proposals up to now, is 3.914 trillion Kenya shillings. Now, there is a reduction of around 270 billion Kenya shillings, but where are we targeting and what is the arithmetic of the entire budget?
Yeah.
The reason why we cut primarily is because we are also looking forward into reducing our debt portfolio as a country. If you look the budget policy statement level and the current estimate level, you realize the huge reduction is in deficit. And what is this that we are calling deficit? When you are making the budget, Yvonne, there is usually the revenue and the expenditure side. The revenue side for our budget, so that I make the point very clear, is made up of a few elements. One is the ordinary revenue. In our current scenario now, the budget we are considering is around 2.913 trillion Kenya shillings. Ordinary revenue is actually taxes.
That's tax collections.
Then number two, there is something we call A&A.
Yeah. That
is the user fee when you get a government service and you pay for it. That's around, precisely around 441 trillion Kenya shillings, or thereabout. Just around 400 billion, sorry, not trillion. Then we expect to get grants of around 51 billion Kenya shillings. If you look at the figure I mentioned before of 3.914 trillion Kenya shillings, then there is some amount of money which you are budgeting for, but is not available on the table.
Yeah.
Primarily, that is what is called deficit.
Yes.
Now, the deficit for this financial year is 514 billion Kenya shillings. Now, comparative, because economics is always comparative. And I've just enumerated around the revenue side, because it is the domain of the point I want to make. Last year, or the previous years, we have had a budget that continues to have a raised, every year, a raised deficit. Now, what we have done this year, Yvonne, is to actually walk the talk. We want to cut on the money we are anticipating to borrow, because we want to perpetually now reduce our debt portfolio, because it's also taking a huge hit on our expenditure side. So in other words, because we measure it not in aggregate figures, but in percentage, last year we had a deficit to GDP ratio of around 5.7% after the revision of the budget. Currently, Yvonne, it will shock you, the budget we are making now has a deficit of just 2.9%. In fact, regionally, in terms of the other regional economies, Kenya is doing very well. In terms of Kenya comparative to other historical budgets, we are doing very well. Because borrowing 514 billion, last year we borrowed much more, I think close to 800 billion Kenya shillings. That shows the route we are taking. Just 1 minute on the other side of the expenditure, so that the point is complete. On the expenditure side, because the national budget, Yvonne, you know, sometimes we put jargons into it, but it's basically just like the household budget. On the expenditure side, we are spending around 1.5 trillion Kenya shillings on recurrent for national government alone. And here national government incorporates judiciary and parliament. I'm giving approximate figures. Around 1.58 trillion Kenya shillings on recurrent.
Yeah.
On development national government, we are anticipating to spend around approximate 720 billion Kenya shillings. The monies we anticipate to set to our counties currently in the current proposals is 391 billion Kenya shillings. Now, even this other figure is what we must work on as a country. There is something we call CFS in the budget.
Yes.
Consolidated Fund Services.
Yeah.
You know, we are spending around 1.3 trillion Kenya shillings on CFS, which is primarily the huge chunk of CFS is usually the repayment of debt in terms of interest rates alone.
Yes.
The second highest is, of course, pensions.
Yes.
But the monies that transfers to commissions.
First phase from the CFS.
CFS is the first charge.
Yes.
Meaning when you are doing our budgeting and funding our budget, one thing that is sacrosanct is CFS. You can argue about all other things.
Debt and paying pension.
Debt,
yes.
Paying pensions,
yes.
And transfers to commissions, yes. Constitutional commissions.
Right.
Now, on that, the 1.2 to 1.3 trillion, and I'm giving ranges because they are still proposals up to now, will be spending 1.08 trillion Kenya shillings. Just imagine, Yvonne, 1.08 trillion Kenya shillings in payment of interest rates. The only good thing about that is that around 750 billion will be interest rates paid to Kenyans out of domestic obligations.
I'd like you to hold there for a minute, and let's hear from you in terms of the rationale that Honorable Nyoro has taken us through in terms of the reduction of debt. I mean, I think we might want to add that even in terms of revenue collection, we had to revise that target for this current financial year that is outgoing. We had to revise that downwards somewhat. Where do you see the budget in terms of what he's saying with, you know, the debt repayment versus the recurrent and the development, which, by the way, we would note that consistently we're spending less on development than we are on recurrent, which is contrary to the PFM Act to begin with.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. First of all, I think it's important to appreciate that we don't have the easiest of times. And the reason is because all the indicators are proving that people are struggling. And when people are struggling, then it means that wherever you put your money should be on things that really affect the day-to-day lives of Kenyans. Having said that, the biggest challenge with this debt discussion is not really the deficit we start with. So basically, the way the budget is organized is that take this current financial year, you start with the equivalent of a 700 shillings deficit. You finish with 785, almost 800 shillings deficit. That's a 9% increment. When you look at the other financial years, say for 2020, 2021, and 2021, 2022, all the other years we have had some years where deficit, basically saying the amount of money that you had hoped to borrow increasing within the year. So the issue is not the deficit you start with. The problem has been the deficit within the year. And how does this come up? It comes up when we fail to meet our revenue targets, as is the case in this financial year, which is ending in June, but we don't reduce our expenditure side. So what happens? Then you have to borrow more. So for me, the challenge has been that yes, you can start with 570 billion in terms of deficit at the beginning of the year, but there's the supplementary 1 and supplementary 2.
Which for the current financial year, we triggered the article for the supplementary budget just 3 weeks into the financial year.
True.
So what does that typically say about our budgeting?
So
3 weeks into it, we have to...
So there you have a critical question about fiscal discipline, which has to do with if I am not able to raise the revenue I anticipated, and even sometimes even the grants and the loans, they come late, that you had anticipated to raise, why not reduce on the expenditure side? Mm-hmm. That's one. Two, I think I'm extremely disturbed by this idea of arguing deficit purely from the percentage side. And this is my concern, that it in a way does not tell us the true story. You know,
what is the true story, Dr.
Yeah, so the true story here is that we still have not had a conversation as a country of what is exactly the GDP figure, the denominator that we are talking about. Even it may interest you actually to look at different documents of government, they actually suggest different figures of GDP.
So the latest economic survey said 15 trillion. Yes.
If you do the percentages, you actually realize we are working with a figure of about 16.2 trillion. And just not too far ago, the Central Bank of Kenya was giving us a figure of about 13.5.
Yeah.
And it is important because these are questions we have raised even to Ndindi's Committee of Budget and Appropriation. It is important for us because that makes you feel like our deficit is very small, but in absolute terms, so that's one. The second thing, which I think is important to talk about, yes, our debt is our biggest risk. Because if in the coming financial year, out of every 100 shillings of these 2.9 trillion that we are planning to raise, out of every 100 shillings that we collect in ordinary revenue, 61 shillings will go to repaying debt. Now remember that your revenue is a forecast. We are in the next 1 week, we will be discussing the finance bill, which is planning to raise another 400 billion, give and take of that. It's something you're expecting. But in the current economic situation, with the kind of flooding that we have had, with the state of performance of jobs and and incomes and household activities, it starts to raise questions that you don't only need to start discussing about how much you raise more, but also how much you can significantly reduce. And a credit to government, because we have seen a reduction. It's the first time we are seeing a reduction from a BPS coming to the estimates.
Right.
Our hope is that we can actually have, though we will have in this discussion, further reductions, in certain other areas, and not necessarily on the most critical areas.
Okay.
As it were.
That's a good place to take it. I want us to take a look at these graphics, what we're calling the winners and the losers in that budget. And so take a look at this. Those who are getting the most. So Treasury has been allocated 17.725 billion, which is a 6 billion shillings increase from the previous year. Defense has been allocated 14.65 billion shillings. That is up from 3.6 billion. That's about an 11 billion shillings increase. TSC is also a winner, and we'll talk about this, getting 9.343. Foreign Affairs is getting 2.54 billion shillings from 1.219 billion. Now, so you take a look at this also, the Department of Immigration and Citizen Services also getting an increase of 1.15, and the National Police Service being one of the biggest winners, up 91 from 91 million to that figure there of 2 billion shillings. Now take a look at this, and we will understand this rationale from Honourable Nyoro for a moment. But let's see where the reductions are, because we've been asking for a reduction of our expenditure, right? But the State Departments of Roads sees a reduction of 48 billion. Higher education has had their allocation decreased by 34 billion. Petroleum decreased by 25 billion. Basic education has been decreased by 19 billion. So when you put that together for higher education and for basic education, it's about 55 billion shillings reduction. Agriculture also sees a reduction of 12.65 billion. Medical services has had their allocation slashed by 10 billion. So this is where we are with these figures, Honorable Nyoro, one would wonder why we are reducing the expenditure for key departments like higher education, basic education, agriculture, medical services, but yet increasing the allocation to Treasury, to foreign affairs, to defense. How do you explain this rationale?
Yvonne, when we are doing the math about what to add and what to deduct, is usually a very wholesome consideration of where the economy is headed and where we want to direct the economy. Let me start first of all with the cuts. The cuts that are shown there, as you realize last year, if you check the budget, in the supplementary estimates, education was one of the highest gainers because there are issues that we needed to fund one of. But more importantly, and I'm glad that you have zoomed in, education seems to have lost. But if you look at even the question you had asked before, for example, about school feeding program, it's not here, but you had asked before.
Yeah.
You realize there is a reallocation of who to handle what. Previously, you realize school feeding program has been at or more or less a parastatal called NACONEC. Then the ministry is reallocating the same for the department to handle exactly those roles. And therefore, in that respect, I want to assure all the people who are supported by government in that regard that will continue.
Because so just to clarify, 2.3 million learners who depend on that school feeding program. When you reduce that allocation from, literally not just reduce it, you slash it from 4.9 billion to 0, you're saying that is reallocated?
Yvonne, I want to assure you, because Citizen TV is here and I'm also around, and I'll be back here. School feeding program is there. For example, you'll find many things in the budget around RDAs, Regional Development Authorities. You realize there is no budget allocated in those kind of sagas because the roles are changing from them to a different area. But let me go back to the point, then we'll come to the school feeding program. Education sector, and especially when you look at higher education, HELB itself runs like a bank. And even when you capitalize a bank, it is not a recurrent scenario. Recapitalizing a bank, you do one-off, and then you let it be. Secondly, if you look at the budgets for higher education over all the years, and this is a scenario that repeats itself, not just in higher education, but across all the other government agencies. Government agencies that collect A&A over time have a tendency of always underestimating their appropriations in aid. And they do that for a purpose. Many times when you're starting off the financial year, you realize that an MDA or a SAGA or a government institution that charges you a fee. For example, in our universities, you pay school fees. That becomes A&A. There is always an understatement. That is why you realize, for example, last financial year, the A&A in our universities is around 60 billion. But when you come now to this time, the projection is 45 billion. And again, because I'll be here back, hopefully, you realize that continues to change now in supplementaries. Because we continue now to, our eyes continue to be more clearer in terms of the amount of A&A that will be collected. There are, of course, cuts across most of the government agencies and MDAs, precisely because of the reason that I gave before, that we cannot continue talking about fiscal consolidation and at the same time we are increasing expenditure. However, in doing all that, we are very mindful about the votes that are very important for the growth of the economy and for the social fabric of Kenya. And that is why you realize, Yvonne, even before even before we talk about the cuts, and I want you to get this figure correct, out of 3.914 trillion budget, 644 billion Kenya shillings is going to education. 555 billion Kenya shillings is going to issues around security. And I'm making this point just to show that some of these areas that we allocate a lot of money, they are areas that are very critical because they are areas that form more or less services that can only be provided by government.
Understood. Dr. Rugo, do you agree with this? Yes, it's 645 billion overall, but when you look at the reduction, and particularly, sector by sector within and departments within that ministry, then it paints the picture.
Yeah, first of all, I think it's important for us to, as a country, and this is a discussion that we have had for some time, to agree on what is our development approach. What is it that we consider development in this country? On one hand, we are saying that we want to build human capital, because that's our essence. We don't have much land that we can do so much. We don't have natural resources, and therefore the assets are the brains of the people. And therefore you cannot not invest in education. One of the things that you miss, and I think it will be important, and we have raised that with the Budget and Appropriations Committee, is that both from the Treasury, you don't have the details. You know, like for instance, Mheshimiwa says that the school feeding program has been reallocated, but it's very difficult to find where.
So where has it been reallocated?
You know, is it to NDMA?
Yeah, so just pause for a minute. So where does the school feeding program go to?
To the department itself. So
currently it's been at?
NACONEC.
True, but the department is the one that has a reduction.
Yes, the department itself has a reduction, no?
So I think it's good.
I mean, this kind of show we provide information.
Yeah.
The information, and I told you, is as I'm telling you, because we are the ones making the budget. School feeding program is not going anywhere. What has happened is the reallocation of the vote, and it's not the first one. It happens across. It is happening currently to another ministry called ASARS and Regional Development, where if you check the budget for Ewasonyiro North, Ewasonyiro South, Coast Development, if you check the budget of TARDA, the budget of all the agencies, which are 6, that deals around regional development, the votes have also been changed to a different area. So it's a normal thing. And I assure you, school program is there.
Dr. Ru?
Perhaps I could finish. So one of the things that I think is important is that we need, as citizens, we need information on what is being reallocated to what and the rationale. I think without a clear rationale, because as he's saying, the regional development authorities have been performing a lot of functions we are devolved functions. You know, so they've been playing a role between counties, you know, and therefore, when you reallocate, you know, for instance, from those, part of it is rationalizing. But when you think about, let's take, for example, you know, and the dictionary has that significant shift. Think about agriculture sector, you know, that also has a significant allocation. Does it mean, for instance, that the allocation that has been removed from agriculture sector, livestock, for instance, has actually been moved to increase their allocations to county governments, you know, because they're the ones which are responsible for that kind of a function. That's information that you do not have, you know, in terms of. But then when you think about where the allocations have gone,
yeah, because I'd like us to focus a little bit on the education sector, because that's big. 42 billion, 0.2 billion. Fine, you know, as a bigger one, but it's also a 7% reduction. But like we said, we don't want to look at percentages, because those can tell us. What are your thoughts around, you know, the specific breakdown within the education sector based on what we've seen with the allocations, and what does that tell you about the priorities? Are you concerned about it?
Yeah, it's very concerned, and we have raised that question because we could not find within the budget documents where this school feeding program, for instance, because, for instance, when you look at the budget documents, this year, it's 0. It's been zeroed from 4.9 to 0. But next year, that is 2025, 2026, there is again another allocation, you know, which then begs the question, which department is going to be handling this and at what cost? But secondly, I think it's also important to say that when you look at the other sectors of education that you know, have had changes, the number of students, particularly at this particular point, you know, there are a number of schools whose infrastructure has been swept by floods. The number of vulnerable children and families that will depend on the school feeding program will move from 2.3, is actually expected to go higher. You know, so given the externalities, you know, that are happening even within the education sector, let's take about the JSS. You have an allocation which is an increment, for instance, to TSC to hire more teachers, but it's only hiring 55% of the number that is required. 45% are still going to remain as interns. What does that mean in the longevity, you know, and the sustainability of the kind of capacity that we need? So for us, it's really a concern. And whether are we saying by not focusing on those aspects, we want more private sector investment? What does that mean for education as a public good and public service. For us, those are the concerns and the questions. And as I've said, really, we don't have details of what has moved where.
Yeah.
You know, yet what we are seeing, and also, let me connect it to something else. At the same time, you also have reductions in social protection programs.
Yes.
A lot of these things are connected, because it's the same children from these vulnerable families, you know, who are benefiting not only from this school feeding program, some of whom are being taken by older members of their families, grandparents and the like, who depend on these cash transfers.
Right.
And therefore that almost, you know, basically just, you know, snowballs the situation.
Right.
You know, so it's a big concern. And as I've said, really, the information on what is moving where, what is the rationale, which I think, as we've said, really, for purposes of the discussion this evening, it will be interesting to hear what is the rationale behind, you know, some of these moves.
Okay. Perhaps you can explain to us, now that we've talked about the safety net programs, that's social protection and disaster response. There's been a 3.23 billion shillings reduction. Considering the extreme weather that we've seen ravaging the country so far, at least for the last part of this financial year, that's likely to go up. And out of that 3.23 billion shillings reduction, 3.05 will be from the kitty for cash transfers to the older persons. Considering the bottom-up economic agenda, and considering that we've been told this budget is particularly designed to ensure that those are going up, Mheshimiwa, how do you explain we have reductions in education, reductions in agriculture, and now reductions in safety net programs, including disaster response, which is one of the key things that we're seeing in the country, and you know, we're likely to see more extreme weather perhaps over the coming weeks?
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Let me start with education. And because my colleague here has talked about infrastructure, and I agree with him, a lot of infrastructure has been damaged by the floods. But if you look at the budget, whereas you may see a slight decrease in terms of the infrastructure first to our various learning institutions, you also realize, Yvonne, that CDF, which primarily deals with education, has had a raise of 2 billion Kenya shillings from the BPS estimates, and an approximate 10 billion Kenya shillings from the last financial year. And CDF deals primarily with around two issues, which is education and also security. And therefore, there will be a lot of investment also from NGCDF, which has proven to be much more efficient when it comes to dealing with that kind of situations. The issue about disaster, you know, Yvonne, the budget we are currently considering is the budget for 24-25. Many times, because of what is happening in the country currently, we may almost tend to think that we should be budgeting for the current situation. The budget we are making is not for now. The budget we are making is for 24-25. And also there are projections about the weather and the rest. But
yeah, those projections exist.
Yes, but more importantly, there are so many agencies in Kenya that are dealing with disaster and issues around infrastructure around this time when we have had a lot of damages.
Which agency? Part
of the money is actually, you see, even going to security organs, is basically primarily going into some of these areas. And also, part of the money...
Sorry, when you say agencies that are dealing with disaster, are you talking about government agencies?
Government agencies, including DOD.
Okay.
They have been part and parcel. One of the areas that we permit to draw monies from the National Treasury and then ask for approvals later from the National Assembly is areas around emergency. You know, Yvonne, we can't sit here and now start talking about the emergencies that could happen in 24-25, because there is no person, however accurate you may be, that you'll be able to project whether we'll have this kind of situation or the other. What we do is to provide sufficient resources, but also there is usually a blanket check of 10% of the budget where we can draw money under Article 223. But also, there are also some other elements I want to highlight, Yvonne, because even when we are talking about decreases, it is important for us to talk about absolutes. Absolutes are also important. TSC is gaining money. TSC is gaining because, and by the way, TSC is the #1 highest institution in terms of funding in Kenya, over 300 billion Kenya shillings. We want to confirm the JSS teachers, and I want to assure them, because I know they are watching, we are going to provision money for the confirmation to permanent and pensionable terms to the JSC teachers who are currently, JSS teachers who are currently interns. My domain is to talk about money, but I'm sure TSC now will talk about the nitty-gritties. Are
you seeing that, Dr. Rugo, just before we continue?
Yeah, so the provision within the budget document and the PS for Education was actually in Parliament today.
Yes.
He actually is making the same questions. He's asking the same questions we're asking. But important is that according to the budget documents, only 55% are scheduled to be absorbed. 45% still will have to remain as interns. That's according to the proposal.
So is it, so is it that there is no understanding? Because we also saw PS Belio keep saying, feeding for the school feeding program.
To be resumed.
Was this information, you see, because clearly you can see, Honorable Nyoro, that there's many people who don't see that reallocation that you are speaking of, including the PS for Education, who one would imagine would
Yvonne, I can tell you around this time, because we are actually retreating as budget committee. All the government accounting officers are our clients. Even after leaving here tonight, I'm going to meet some of the accounting officers who are PSs and also parastatal heads. Reason is this. In government, however generous you become in terms of budget, everyone pulls and requests for more. You pull the blanket to your side and you always seek for more. And therefore, Yvonne, let's not cherry pick. I want you to check all the appearances of MDAs in the departmental committees in the National Assembly. You realize one thing. It is like they had met before. No one has come before in the departmental committee to say, now we have sufficient resources, please you can cut some more. So that is the situation.
So you're saying and they want more than, what is feasible?
I can tell you.
Why would they want that?
Like the highlights that you made about MDAs that are gaining. If they are to appear here now, they'll still need more money because all the government MDAs, they want to do much more. They want to impact more. And therefore, we may not discuss that the PS was requesting for more money. That is obvious, that every PS is requesting for more money. What is of importance is where we are directing the limited resources into. And I was in the process of doing that.
Carry on.
For example, when you look at areas around agriculture, we may be talking about cuts. That's fine. But we need to look at what are the cuts against. We need to compare the budget between the last budget that was made even before we came in and the current budget. You realize there has been capitation and investment in agriculture. And let me give you a scenario, Yvonne, if you permit. Because I don't want us to talk about all these things in context, if you give me permission. Because this may take around 2.5 minutes. Now, we are dealing with the economy of Kenya here, Yvonne. When you are dealing with the economy of Kenya, all the other things you are talking about are the parts. The whole is the economy, and it can also be said to be the welfare of the Kenyan people. Now, let's try to compare, because what you are doing, we have also done for 1 year. So that even as we explain, we try to show whether we are making the right decisions. Because appropriating money, allocating money, the number one question, do you know what you are doing in the first place? So let me go to the year 2023, because I was here in Citizen TV talking about it, so that we see whether we knew what we are doing and therefore try to juxtapose the same with what we are doing. The economy of Kenya in 2023, Yvonne, grew by 5.6%. The economy of Kenya was around the 26th fastest growing economy in the whole world. The economy of Kenya can be explained in 3 parameters. One is GDP, which I've explained. The number 2, and I want to totally disagree with my brother, Dr. Rugo, is about inflation. Because when you talk about hardships, then you're talking about the cost of living. Inflation in Kenya in 2022 was almost going to double digit. Currently, as we talk, Yvonne, the inflation in Kenya is 5% in April. If you look at the currency, the deviation around our currency, because those 3 things are very critical, and is around which all these other things that we do. The Kenya shillings has gained 14% against the greenback, has gained around 15 to 20% against the regional currencies. Why am I explaining about this and we are talking about budget? Budget actually becomes low. Finance bill, which I'm sure is also ongoing alongside budget, those are the 2 primary pillars that end up shaping the economy of Kenya. What am I trying to say? The things that we did in our last budget has yielded an economic growth in terms of GDP of what I said. But then we have also retreated and decided as the servants of the Kenyan people. But even as I come to Citizen TV to talk about GDP growth, Kenyans, it's better off when Kenyans are feeling it in their pockets.
Are they feeling it, though?
That is precisely the reason why you look at our allocations of the budget money. We are putting money into where the people are, the labor-intensive industries, so that even as we allocate money,
so
Yvonne, the money also perpetuates egalitarianism and also putting money to where the Kenyan people are.
All right, so the Kenyan people are at the Treasury with a 6 billion shillings increase. They're at Defense with an 11 billion shillings increase. We're just trying to understand, you know, where they are. And where there are increases that would then justify, you know, we're trying to understand, that would then justify what you're saying, which would be labor intensive. Indeed, many economists continue to say that even in this country, we are producing you know, informal jobs that are low paying, many of those that are even below the threshold of 24,000. Experts at Deloitte were this week saying that most of those informal low paying jobs are jobs that pay 15,000 shillings, which is below even the tax threshold, that then does not even aid what you're saying, which is in the budget. So which are these high labor intensive areas? Because from what we are seeing, it is away from agriculture, which is, you know, the economy's mainstay. It would be away from, you know, other critical sectors like manufacturing that people are saying this is where the money should be. So show us where these monies are, because what we're seeing is increases in places that perhaps don't tally with what you're saying.
I think it's part of the initial discussion. Budget is 3.914 trillion Kenya shillings, Yvonne. Then economy grew in 2023. You try to achieve two things when you try to build an economy or a society that is egalitarian. You invest in social services, which is actually guaranteeing the people who are not participating, even in the baking of the cake, that they'll have a share. Second is to incentivize areas that majority of Kenyans are. But as you do that, at the back of your mind as you plan, you always have economic parameters in your mind. So when I talk about these issues, I've belabored the point about education. Many times, Yvonne, we talk about education like it is a recurrent expenditure. In fact, to me, I see education as a social investment. This is guaranteeing that child in every part of Kenya that the government is doing an investment in that human capital, which will make sense later in the future. Second is agriculture. If you look at the aggregate budget in agriculture, the one that is left in the national government and the one that is devolved into our counties, you realize we have also investing a lot of money into agriculture. And I want to tell you why. Though we have belabored this point so often, 70% of the rural population in Kenya, including Murang'a and all the other parts of Kenya, 70% are engaged in agriculture. Many times we can let agriculture participants who are farmers go about their business. But even when you are studying the economy, the goal of the economist, one, is to move subsistence engagements into being capitalistic. Right. And for you to do that is, first of all, to look at the 70% of the Kenyan people living in rural areas. How do you incentivize these people to move from subsistence so that whatever they do makes sense in the capitalistic economy? That is why the government has been investing a lot of money into inputs around agriculture. And if we had more time, I would have elaborated. That is why when you look at the budget currently, you see in cooperatives. You may not see it in agriculture. You see in cooperatives, both in terms of coffee and milk, we have input money in the supplementary budget, estimates 2, that we are considering, and also in the main estimates of 24-25. This money could be in cooperatives, but it's going into agriculture, primarily into coffee farming in terms of the cherry fund, which we want actually to transform that money or that fund to have a guaranteed minimum return. If you look at the milk side has several components. One is modernization. We have been capitalizing new KCC, even the previous budget. Why? We want it to be more efficient, but efficiency for what? You look at the tendency around milk. when we have abundance of rain, then there is a correlation, if you look at the time series data, that when there are rains, then the milk prices fall. We have been wanting to correct that, and we are doing that through allocation, so that new KCC can be able to modernize their industries so that they can be able to transform liquid milk into powder at a considerable cost. If you look at it the other side, we have also given new KCC money for mopping up of milk when it is so abundant. If you look at the allocation around, Yvonne, around other things I want to interest you about, let me go backwards a little bit. Kenya as an economy, our number one import in Kenya is fuel. The vehicle, the industry one.
Wait, hang on.
I was going to, it's still agriculture.
No, yeah.
It is still agriculture. I'm making this point.
Okay,
number
very
two,
quickly, because we want to understand this, and I want us to do sector specific.
Very good.
Yeah.
I'm still on that point. Number one import is fuel. Number two is edible oils. Kenya spends 100 billion to 150 billion Kenya shillings in edible oils. You know, it doesn't seem logical. It actually also doesn't seem real that our number two import in Kenya is edible oils. What are we doing? Beyond providing fertilizer, if you go to Kenya Seed, for example, even through their A&A and through allocation in the budget, we are providing farmers with inputs around production of what is needed for the manufacture of edible oils. Canola, sunflower, because we also want to import substitute. And the more the reason I told you, as we talk about issues that are program-based, at the back of our mind, when we are planning even around budget, we also have economic parameters. For example, when you are attacking the issue of edible oils, yes, we are capacitating farmers, we are putting money where the farmers are, but on the other side, we have currency in our mind through the balance of payment, we have import substitution in our mind also.
Yeah.
Dr. Ugo?
You know, I've been listening very keenly, I think it will be important when the committee retreats to actually look at these numbers, because all those sectors that Mheshimiwa has talked about are the ones that have cuts. State Department for Investment Promotion, 3 billion cut. State Department for Irrigation, 4 billion cut. State Department for Agriculture, 12 billion cut. State Department for Livestock Development, 4 billion cut. So you realize that whereas the conversation and even the bottom up, the beta model is about invest and putting more resources in the areas that basically create. Because you see, why I'm against this idea of just focusing on GDP growth is that GDP growth is of very limited value unless it translates to creation of employment and economic opportunities. What I mean by economic opportunities, that the person producing avocados is able to sell those avocados and be able to make a return. Yeah. The person producing milk is able to sell their milk. But if, for instance, we still are focusing on import substitution, which basically means we are actually focused more on how much we are getting from outside, and not how much, we are supporting. Farmers still have to queue, for instance, to sell their maize, in place, to sell their vegetables, to be able to, the economic activities, in terms of just creating an environment that, for me, those are the things that basically, create and support incomes. Because right now, why are Kenyans, in different places, Kapenguria, in Lambwe, and all these other places, why are they troubled? Why are they? They are troubled because the taxation that they are supposed to pay versus the services that they are receiving is actually being substituted by their out-of-pocket.
Right.
When you go to a health facility you still have to buy buy drugs. If you go to school, you still have to buy books and what have you. If you are on the road, you are having to spend much more
to service your car because some of the roads, are either not maintained. And these are the things that actually facilitate economic activity.
So what you're saying, Dr. Rugo, is looking at the economy as a whole and in totality, in line with what Honorable Nyoro is saying. For instance, you talk about, edible oils being one of our biggest imports and incentivizing areas like the manufacturing sector. Ndindi, you say that, but edible oil manufacturers are then up in arms because of a 25% excise duty that's being charged on vegetable oils as part of the Finance Bill 2024. So it would seem that on one end, when you're saying you want to incentivize, on this, because the budget is the total, right? The expenditure and the revenue. So on one end, you're saying you want to incentivize them. But there's a lot that's happening on the other side, which is the Finance Bill. So how do you explain then what you were saying about, spurring investment in manufacturing? Edible oil manufacturers are saying if you impose that 25% excise duty on vegetable oils, that will have a direct impact on their work, on how much they're able to produce, and at the other end onto consumers. So it would seem, does it seem like there's a disconnect in the budget as a whole, like not looking at what you were saying, the totality of the economy?
From where I sit, what you've talked about, Yvonne, is a comma, not a but. It is a continuation. When you want to protect the local industry, like the one we are creating now, a nascent sector, all the economists in the world protect their industries. And that is precisely what that exercise is doing. It is actually adding on to what I talked about, that as you protect the local farmers before they pick up and become competitive in terms of local production, then they have to be protected. But economically, everything has to give way, because we say in the economy is a double-edged sword. When you are protecting the producer, then in one way or the other, then the consumer becomes the buffer and becomes the shock absorber. So when on this side you want to protect the farmer, the producer, but on the other side you want to protect the consumer of edible oils. So at some point, you have to do a balance.
Will pay 80% more for that. The manufacturing sector, particularly for edible oil, says if this goes up, they could lose up to 40,000 jobs in the sector. Manufacturing is a labor-intensive sector. So, what are we doing here? And many of these companies are actually value-adding to
actually, what I want
if I can finish.
Okay.
So, Yvonne, in other words, what I'm trying to say, on this side, you are capacitating farmers. Then you have to decide which policy you are taking. But I was just saying that when you are doing all these proposals, including the budget, every shilling you are allocating, you are taking from somewhere. So it's a double-edged sword. So you have to know and find a balance and then come up with a Kenyan who is not strictly a straitjacket producer or a straitjacket consumer. You have to come up with a Kenyan who is a producer-consumer. So that as you think about this Kenyan, you are thinking about the welfare of the producer and at the same time thinking about the welfare of the consumer. But there's something else that Dr. Rugo talked about, that the things that I highlighted around the areas that we are doing, that they have suffered cuts. And I agree, because this budget was about cuts. And I think even in the opening statements of Dr. Rugo, he actually commended the fact that we are cutting budget from the BPS level to the current level. What is of importance is to zoom in. Many times we get lost in these cuts, this was cut. Yvonne, if you look at the budgets, for example, even in the previous years, the rearrangement of the budget, I'm not talking about the food, like the one we are talking about, the food program. Reorientation of the budget, by the way, is more important than the allocation. And I give you a scenario with agriculture, because that is what Dr. Rugo cited as having suffered cuts. Agriculture, for example, if you look at the budget of agriculture, you will find tens of billions of shillings in foreign-funded projects. These foreign-funded projects, they have very rosy names. You will find an agricultural program with a very enticing headline. Then you zoom into what actually this program is doing, probably funded by World Bank or the other one. The money we end up still paying anyway because they are debts. You realize this money is domiciled in agriculture. It is money that is building culverts. It is money that is building, has very little, is building actually roads in rural areas. So in the sense of it...
Can you show us some of those votes?
I want you to check, for example, the recent advert by a program called CVAP. You check that advert, which is domiciled in the Ministry of Agriculture, and you tell me what is agriculture about building culverts and building Moram roads. So many times we may see like there is a cut, but in the real sense of the meat, you may realize the issues that are really touching on the real agriculture has been enhanced. And that is what we've done to reorient our budget, reorient our money in the situation where when you put a shilling here, you can actually see its output on the other side.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Dr. Hugo?
Yeah, I think I'm first pleading with Mheshimiwa because his committee is the one that will make the final decisions. These are estimates. And because he said that the goal is to cut, why then don't we go for the jugular and just cut, properly? Because when you look at, for instance, State Department for Housing and Urban Development, I know that's where the housing levy is. You have a 7 billion increase. You have the State Department for Immigration and Citizen Services, a 2 billion increase. You have the State Department for Transport, State Department for Devolution, State Department, all of them. But look at a State Department that is very critical for State Department for Micro, Small and Medium Enterprises Development. You have just a 704 million. In other words, my question when I was starting is to say, are we increasing in the right places? Are we decreasing the right places? Where the country is right now, you want to decrease in places that are more facilitatory in the sense of they are concerned about public administration in general, but you want to increase in sectors that have a direct impact on jobs creation, on manufacturing, which has been suffering over the years. Right. Agriculture has been suffering over the years. And I asked, does it mean that because we are reducing State Department for Agriculture, the discussion around donor-funded projects notwithstanding, are we increasing the amounts of money that are going to county governments, and the report you ran earlier here, even the delays that go with that. Are we addressing, so for instance, even the consumption power of the people who are actually supposed to be driving the economy? The taxes, and on this, allow me to throw in a spanner in the works, and this is the discussion I was having with him earlier about pensions. Rural economies, which he talked about, are driven largely by pensioners. Not always, but there are a lot of people, when they retire, they go back.
Right.
We know very well, the Public Service Commission, just even in the wage bill conference the other day, indicated that we still have a huge number of pensioners' claims that have not been processed. It takes about 3 to 5 years, to be able to process your pension. If you are saying we want to facilitate, and then, as I've said earlier, you're even reducing on the cash transfer program, the social safety net program, that is targeting those old people. Yeah. So for me, if we are going to reduce, let us reduce even, even in the National Police Service. Are we saying that because we are not creating jobs, therefore we need to create a more security state? And it's all a development. Dr. Ndindi, the advisor, wrote a very interesting paper a couple of years ago about approaches to development. Do you invest in social security or do you invest in physical security? Do you invest in human capital or do you invest in physical capital? Because each of them is a model that enables you. So for me, the concern is not that we shouldn't be reducing. I am pushing for reduction so that then we live.
But in the right.
But let us reduce in sectors that are of general administration, and let us increase in sectors and in departments that have a direct impact on the lives of citizens. Because that's then how we start now addressing the question of the cost of living. Right. That's how we start addressing incomes. And that's how we even start going back to saying this was the model of, of the government of the day, which was a bottom-up, kind of model of saying, can we invest where the rubber meets the road?
I want to ask you this, because when we talk about whether this is a Mwananchi budget or not, and in what ways that we're able to spur, first of all, economic growth and jobs, which then has a, turnaround effect on, the more people have better paying jobs, then, they'll pay taxes, and that then funds the budget for the year. But it's also key with ensuring that you carry everybody along in that economic growth and those social safety net programs. So, Honorable Nyoro, this is the question that baffles many. If you take a look at some of these reductions and in some of the places where you're seeing massive increases in billions. So you've said that there's the feeding program that has been reallocated, but we're seeing reduction in agriculture, in health, in education. If you take a look at the social safety net programs, those have reduced. That allocation has reduced. And considering the country is still, sort of building back from the COVID-19 pandemic, not to mention all of these other shocks that we continue to experience. The Women Enterprise Fund is down by 40%. The cash for the elderly, that's where you're taking about 3.05. Disaster response mechanisms, have seen a reduction. And remember, disasters hit the vulnerable the hardest. The free maternity program is down by 50%. Leaving about 1.29 million mothers who are targeted by this program. You're seeing a 50% reduction in budgets for orphans and vulnerable children in terms of health insurance. So many would then question, if you take a look at these reductions in sectors that would spur economic growth, and also sectors that would ensure social safety nets that carry everybody along, and yet we see billions of shillings of increase in other areas that perhaps don't. Explain this rationale to us and whether this is still a bottom-up economic agenda that starts with the people that need it the most and carries them along.
Yvonne, the reason why I actually went back to the discussion around economic parameters is because, fortunately... Or
are we saying they're okay? The people are fine and they can now, sort of deal with things themselves?
If we reach that level, then there is no need for us to be in offices.
So why the reductions then in these key areas?
The economy is always dynamic. And the reason I started with parameters, I went back there to parameters because we'll carry all these parameters up to the end of this discussion. There is no other known way of measuring whether the economy is progressing or digressing other than economic parameters, which is GDP, which is the other ones that I gave around inflation, and also like the currency, how the currency is doing. If you look at those, and I'm coming there, I'm coming there.
Just to clarify, because, we speak to Mwananchi as well. So when we talk about GDP and inflation and all of these big words, and they're important, don't get me wrong. But, there's 1.9 million mothers who today are asking, so what happens to me? GDP notwithstanding. There's 2.3 million children who ask, so what happens to me? GDP and that big picture notwithstanding, because the budget has to make sense to those people as well. And so that's why that question, granted your explanation on that, but my question is, when you speak to Mwananchi, how do you then justify these reductions that I have talked about? GDP and our country faring perhaps better, in the region based on those numbers and percentages with debt to GDP ratio. But the reality is for these millions of Kenyans, both children, pregnant mothers, women, the elderly, the vulnerable, orphans, what do you say to them and how do you justify those close to half reductions in allocations for things that are very important to them?
Yvonne, I was not actually intending to go back to those GDP issues. I'm just trying to make a point that wherever we take this discussion, economically speaking, you still have to refer to empirical data. And empirical data is the one that I gave that shows Kenya in 2023 was one of the best performing economies in the world. But then you have asked a very valid question, Yvonne. And I'll try to highlight just a few points based on what you've asked and also the reaction from Dr. Rugo. Let me, as I come to close into your last question, start from there where he started. The increments, the decrements. He talked about housing. Housing, there is an increment. And he talked about it like there is a problem with an increment in housing. From where we sit in terms of our policy, housing, we have voiced it very loudly, very specifically, that housing is very critical and important to us. Not just because we are building abodes, but because we are creating jobs. Exactly now the same question that you've asked. Secondly, we are talking about immigration like it is an undeserving department. Immigration is one of the highest A in A earners in Kenya in terms of passports and also the other documents that are provided by that department.
So why would then it need an increase in allocation if they already have more in appropriations and aid?
Now, Yvonne, what happens, and I want to talk slowly here, when the immigration department creates A in A, unfortunately, it does not benefit from that A in A. All the collections that are collected by immigration goes into the consolidated fund. It goes into the budget. So in fact, one of the proposals we've been wanting to do is to give them a slice of the monies that are raised through immigration. So the 2 billion we are putting into immigration is basically to capacitate what majority of Kenyans have been asking, that we need a more efficient manner of getting passports. We are responding to that. Why is passport important? Because all these things are important. And forgive me when I become also macro and micro at the same time. Why is 2 billion important, or that we are giving to immigration? If you look at the data for the same year that I quoted, Yvonne, you realize if you look at the recent figures, the monies that we get, the remittances, the monies that we get from Kenyans working abroad went up by 18%, Yvonne. In fact, in our current account, which forms part of the balance of payment, it was one of the highest contributors. This is related. That's what I've been saying, that when we put money, we see the output. When there is efficiency in passports, we have more Kenyans going to work elsewhere. We have more labor that is working outside and therefore bringing money back. Secondly, you talked about devolution. Devolution had an increment. But devolution ministry houses what? Devolution ministry or department or that arena, it is the same that houses. It is the same where ASALS is domiciled and regional development is domiciled. When you talk about ASALS, we are talking about emergencies also. So when we add money into devolution, I thought it is a good thing, because based on the question that you have asked, then we need more preparedness to take care of the most vulnerable who have been victims of what has been happening. Secondly, about the cuts, we are talking about micro. There is nothing wrong, Yvonne, when we cut money from SME sector. Why? We already have, in quotes, a bank called Hustler Fund, where the government has put in money, 10 billion, an extra 5 billion. I said before, when I was talking about the other issue, there are issues that you put money or areas that the money is revolving. When you borrow money from Hustler Fund, you are returning that money back. So we cannot keep on measuring whether the government is serious about Hustler Fund by the allocation. No, that is not the point. The point is the initial allocation is still there. Whatever the government does ultimately later is adding up to that capital, because capital is the one that necessitates that fund to lead. Then coming back to the question you asked, Kenya, we have cut money here, we have cut money there, we have cut money the other place. Yvonne, and it's good you give us such a platform to explain to our bosses, who are the people of Kenya. Many times I sit down and even I converse with the president. Kenya, in paper, is a capitalistic economy. Capitalistic economy is where the government should enable and everyone to mind about their business, they make their money, and they go about their business. Yvonne, but unfortunately, if you look at the tendency of how we are progressing as a country, we are going back to a theory in economics called New Growth Theory, where as the economies grow and societies progress, then the people demand more from government. And by the way, that could be precisely the reason why you may be calling Honorable Kimani Kuria here, where I am, maybe later. That the government wants to raise more revenue. What is it for? So, as we cut, as we add, in our economy, what is the definition of our economy? From where I sit, I think through the allocation and budget, we have now gravitated into a socialist economy. Why am I saying so?
But you've gravitated into, okay, look, the one question of mine which you've not answered is to speak to those 2.3 million children, those mothers. In fact,
they are the ones I'm speaking
to. No, speak to them in practical terms that they can understand, Mheshimiwa. But let's go to Dr. Rugo for a minute.
I think it's important for us to raise a couple of things. First, let's talk about this Hustler Fund. I think it might help to actually dig in, Mheshimiwa, and appreciate that actually a lot of the Hustler Fund borrowing has not been for enterprise. It has been Fuliza type. And I think it's important because until recently, we still have people borrowing very small amounts, you know, as it were. And there's still a multiplicity of institutions. So the question to ask, and Hustler Fund has designed a 15 billion fund, cannot finance all the MSMEs we are talking about. Our concern has been, can financial institutions, which now have found government as a place to do business in terms of lending to government, actually facilitate, that kind of a business. But the housing question as a means of creating employment, I don't want to go back into this conversation because it's a hot debate. But what we still do not have, and even the economic survey yesterday, that was released yesterday by KNBS, yesterday, did not indicate, for instance, how many jobs actually, I've had people say, jobs are going to be created. How many jobs actually are we creating? But what need are we responding to? There are 12.5 million households in Kenya. 89% of the ones in rural areas live in their own homes. 21% in urban areas live in their own homes. And in urban areas, the issue is not access, it's affordability. In this city, you have a glut of houses, but cannot be afforded. So is the solution to go and build more houses among the 89%, or to create affordability for these assuming the 21% and the extra in urban areas actually want to own a home? That's not a question also we have answered, whether people actually want to own a home or they want to live in a place where they are comfortable, whether they are renting or not. And so the argument about building houses as a means of creating employment and incomes still does not, and yet especially when you don't add up that with a creation of an environment where you are able to an environment where you are able to actually produce the various materials that you are going. I mean, you had clinker, had more tax, and what have you? Right. Cement has gone up, steel has gone up, because those are the facilitatory. But secondly, I think it's important for us, because budget is about trade-offs. Budget is about give and take. These people that we are saying that their incomes are not improving, they are having to provide for themselves services that are supposed to be publicly provided, are the same people we want them to pay taxes and pay more taxes. How is that possible? And perhaps that explains why then we are not able to meet even our tax targets. Because if my incomes are not improving, whether inflation numbers are going up or down, because you still have less to spend. You still have less to spend. Right. You have less to save. You have less to invest, and I think that's important. But let me pick 2 points that he spoke about that I think are important to discuss: import subsidization, as well as in taxes. So, for instance, on edible oil, my understanding is that you control. You create, you protect what you produce. Because you are citizens, so that, for instance, you cannot start protecting edible oil production, yet you are still importing it. In that sense, because then the cost is transferred. The same way you also cannot just keep increasing taxes on petroleum, which you are still importing, until you have your own source. That's the only time then now you can say, now because, for instance, if you're producing our own cars, let's now increase taxes, as it were. But lastly is our structure of government and how we intend, for instance, to pursue this development. It is of concern that we have decided that Constituency Development Fund, the National Government Constituency Development Fund, is our mechanism of, for instance, developing school infrastructure. 20 years ago, in 2003, when we started CDF, there was a clear need and a reason for us to go the Constituency Development Fund way. Why? Because we still had not established a proper devolution structure. Now we have a devolution structure which has the administrative systems that are supposed to be facilitating that, including for managing education sector. Before the current constitution, we already had an excess of, for instance, of health facilities that are not provided, that do not have doctors and nurses. And perhaps, again, a discussion back, is it time to actually rethink the role of National Government Constituency Development Fund, for instance, because he has mentioned it as where the resources are going, that you are cutting on infrastructure development. Do they have the framework to be able to provide and build these schools when you have a whole national government and on the other side you have county governments, you know, which have their administrative structures that are supposed to be able to produce. Is indeed time then to rethink, is the mechanism which still receives 2.5% of the national government allocation.
So take the money to where it actually...
Precisely, because the principle in devolution is take the money to the level to which it is best applied for purposes of service delivery.
Right.
You know, I think it's a critical
Funds
question.
Following function.
Yeah.
Okay, gentlemen, I want us to take some feedback just as we close our conversation here. Let's take a look at some of these tweets that are coming in. This one is from Razula. Says, kindly ask Ndindi, what's the essence of reporting deficit to GDP, whereas we all know they'll eventually increase it through unnecessary supplementary budgets 3 or 6 months after the budget is read. And I think this came up, you know, at the start of our conversation in terms of fiscal discipline. You know, what is the challenge? What would your response to that?
Yvonne, we give it because that's what it is. That the current deficit to GDP ratio is 2.9%. Evidence is there to show that we have been climbing down on borrowing since we took over, and I think that is correct to do. And also, secondly, when you cut me short, I was talking about socialist economy. I was actually answering your question. All the items you touched about from they are welfare in nature. So you realize in our budget, Yvonne, in the budget that I talked about, 642 billion going to education, 555 billion to security, facilitative security. We spent around 30 billion Kenya shillings into cash transfer. So when you see marginal cuts, there are considerations around the numbers and the beneficiaries. So I want to assure all the people who are a part and parcel of all the items that you mentioned, due consideration was done. There is no cut that has been done arbitrarily, and especially on areas that are very critical to Kenyans. All the Kenyans who've been receiving cash transfer, none will miss. There has been empirical data to show the number was this last time, it is likely to be this year. And that is what we are basing on.
So what are you saying then? That the number of older persons who require cash transfers has decreased and that is what has justified the reduction? Or I just want to understand.
There are two things that I've seen recurring around those, most of the areas that you touched about on. Could be two reasons. One, in terms of the change of number, but two, in regards to over-allocation of the previous period. Remember, when you're talking about reductions, you are not talking about it in absolute. It is comparative in nature. So you need to compare what was and what is. But the other issue, in a very brief manner, Dr. Rugo talked about Hustler Fund and it is not for enterprise. Maybe for the level of Dr. Rugo and income. Majority of Kenyans borrow from Hustler Fund for enterprise. And that is the reason why it was designed. Secondly, Hustler Fund is not the only tool for capacitating credit. It actually came in to correct market failure, where these people or these very valuable Kenyans could not be acceptable in banks. Banks could not advance them any credit, and therefore the only that was available was predatory through Shylocks. So it was a correction of market failure. The same government has Kenya Industrial Estates. It relates to industries. The same government is facilitating a very efficient credit market in our banks now for every other person. And maybe the other thing I heard from Dr. Rugo is about jobs. Dr. Rugo, to be honest with you, our scenario is not to create jobs in terms of public sector. If you look at the data which you have there, you realize that in the first time since, the P in government is either stagnating or going down in many sectors. Because our approach is not to create a behemoth of a public sector. Our domain is to create an enabling environment for the private sector to create jobs. Okay, if you go through the data released yesterday by Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, private sector added 800,000 jobs in the last year under consideration. Those are jobs not created by government, but created by the environment created by government.
The same members of the private sector, insurers, bankers, edible oil manufacturers, many of them continue to complain of the high taxation, you know, in that regard. Even the Federation of Kenya Employers complains about the same thing. And that's what we're talking about, the totality of it. On one end, we say that this is happening, but on the other, we still see, you know, measures that the very same private sector has been up in arms over. But I still want you to answer the question from the viewer who talks about the issue of fiscal discipline. And it is the idea that, we look at what we have within the budget, we say this is the budget deficit, but very soon after, we see a supplementary budget. Perhaps you could speak to that. And like we said at the start of this program, we saw one just 3 weeks into the financial year, this current one that is, outgoing. What does that say, even about the budget itself? Is it a farce if within months, then you need to revise things and, move things upwards? And many of the allocations in that supplementary budget went higher to certain offices. So what is it we're doing? We can't budget, we can't live within our means, at least, on the side of the executive?
Yvonne, supplementary budgets, they come for different reasons. Let me speak about the current one. Many times we make a supplementary budget close to the close of the financial year is basically to align the government financials. And also the question you asked, why do we make a budget? Then you keep changing it. Remember, Yvonne, the same way you make a budget in your household is the same way the government makes, whereas maybe the government is based on some expert consideration so that we make an opinion that is considered. But it still remains a projection. Let me give a case scenario. Supplementary one, if you look, we added around 140 billion Kenya shillings into payment of interest rates for our financial obligations, that is loans. If you look at the current one, you realize now the consideration for monies going into interest rates is falling. Why is that? When we were passing the supplementary estimates close to end of last year, Kenya shillings to USD was around 81, was going to 180 Kenya shillings to greenback, meaning our foreign debt, which is majorly dollar denominated, had to be serviced in dollars, but you are collecting taxes in Kenya shillings. Now, when the shilling is 130 to the greenback, then we are adjusting the same to reflect the reality. That yes, we need to pay interest rates in dollars, but our collection is in Kenya shillings, but our Kenya shilling has also strengthened. And I'll tie the same to one of the issues that was raised by Daktari here. And I had like he was brandishing the issue of import substitution. And to be fair to each other, and I don't want to go to that very deep issues about macros and jargons. When you are dealing with the economy around the money we pay outside and the money that we get paid inside, we talk about balance of payment. When you talk about balance of payment, and these things are critical, it's made up of three things primarily. One is an account called the current account, which records the goods and services we are selling in and out. And one of the ways to capacitate and to bridge the gap, number one is to cut on what we are paying outside. What you are paying outside is the import. You cut on what you are paying outside, which we are precisely doing with edible oils. The other element there around capital account is remittances, which I talked about. They have gone up 18%, partly out of global scenarios around inflation easing in the US and the rest, but more primarily because of the policies that we have instituted. The second one is capital account, around the balance of payment. And the other one is a financial account. Why am I talking about all these things? I've talked about them because that point from my colleague here around import substitution, which other tool then do you use? You are currently consuming edible oils bought from outside. Our farmers can grow sunflower. Our farmers can grow canola. Which other method other than capacitating the farmers to grow the same and you
but
substitute?
Are we capacitating the manufacturing sector to be able to take up what is being grown by the farmers? Because manufacturers still complain. According to the economic survey, the manufacturing sector actually shrunk in the year 2023, this current year 2024. So it's one thing to capacitate the farmers. They're able to grow all of these raw materials. But are we then capacitating the manufacturing of the same that then adds value to the raw materials? Because manufacturers then are still complaining. So, you know, in the scheme of things, then are there complaints? Is what you're saying that their complaints are not valid? Would they then have a reason to be dishonest about the situation in their sector?
They are complaints and they are valid. But then where does the economy start, Yvonne? Where does
You're the one who told us
yes,
it's
exactly.
holistic, so you look at it in
Perfect.
totality. So if you are reducing here, you are incentivizing here. But if you are, increasing taxes on imports,
Yes.
but you're not incentivizing local
yes.
manufacture, then what happens at the end of the day? It's the consumer that hurts the most, because they're the ones who want those products. But if they're not being produced locally at a rate that is cost effective, even when you take a look at the taxes that are put in there, the cost of electricity, its regular supply, all of these issues are in totality. So what people see is, a reduction or an increase that hurts them at the end of the day.
I was asking a rhetorical question, Yvonne, and I appreciate your precise questions, and I'll try to be equally precise. Where does the economy start? And Kenya is also borrows from what has happened in the past. Economies always start with, before you go to manufacturing, what are you manufacturing? That is why if you look at the stages of economic growth, from subsistence you come to agriculture. Agriculture gives back to industry. Industry gives back to better industry. Then industry gives birth to service. Service gives back to a consumer market. What am I trying to say? So Kenya is here now, trying to domicile and trying to have manufacturing of edible oils. What should come first? And I think what should come first is supposed to be manufactured, not what is manufacturing. And therefore, what to be manufactured is the produce from agriculture. It is out of the surplus of agriculture that industry is birthed. And therefore, Yvonne, I think I have answered you.
Yeah, but I think it's important.
And we need to conclude this conversation.
Yeah.
We could be here.
Yeah. No, true. But I think it's important to say that what Mheshimiwa is saying is good. I mean, it's basic theory. But in terms of practice, the fact that you have seen agriculture shrink from 25% contribution to GDP to 19.8%, the manufacturing sector has not necessarily grown with an equal, so because you will be saying that the manufacturing sector now is growing. The manufacturing sector actually has stagnated at about 4-3% in terms of growth. In terms of investment, and because, I mean, and we can debate it's more not even debating, it's actually just stating the things that they are. The fact that we still are focusing on importation, which benefits a certain component of business. But then, when you come to the taxes that you have introduced and everything, and manufacturers have been up in arms, saying, we are struggling. Bottom line, I think the budget will only be of value when it addresses the needs of a society at that particular point. I think it is also important to say that the budget we are talking about is going to be implemented 41 days from now. Mm-hmm. So we are not talking about 4 months from now. It's July 1st, which is basically 41 days, a month, and the like. And the fact that we have seen supplementary budget, which I think worries me, especially when Mheshimiwa says that it's normally used to correct financials, yes. Which basically means you go spend the way you want, then you present, with a budget, with a supplementary budget. 1 week, there's one time it came, 1 week.
1 week after.
Yes, on June 24th.
Yes.
I still remember.
Not this time.
but the other one came 3 weeks after
this
being read.
This current one came 3
at
weeks.
the beginning of the final.
Yeah.
So for me, it's let's be honest with ourselves and say, yes, we know there are many factors that affect, but there is no way we can be so wrong to miss what will happen in a month. There is no way we can assume that by the time the next financial year starts, for instance, Mheshimiwa, we will not be dealing with the effects of the current floods. So that we cannot say that we are only going to deal with it in this financial year, which is ending in 41, is ending in the next month. Okay. These issues are going to be addressed. Please remember, we still have not resolved the question of sufficient infrastructure for JSS in the education sector. We still have not resolved that. We are sorting out the teachers, but the infrastructure still had not been completed, as it were. And thirdly, I really want to plead with the committee on budget chaired by yourself. When you retreat, kindly, since this is a budget for cutting, cut on these administrative aspects. Let us increase on things that address the needs of the now. And the now is what facilitates activity into the future. Tomorrow. In tomorrow. Because if we don't deal, I mean, the news you've just read today, including of drugs that have not been paid for, of 3.6 billion, as it were, that has an impact of a child not being immunized at the time they're supposed to be immunized. Nutrition, that has an impact,
an impact on the health budget.
On growth of the child,
right,
as it were, which affects the human capital that we are talking about into the future. And therefore, so that then we balance and say, we are going to make painful choices right now, but it's because we want to invest into what will make a difference into the future. But lastly, we've talked about debt, we have beaten it, we have said all manner of things. One, we still need more information in terms of what are we paying for, why are we paying for it. Two, we need better accountability of where have we spent this debt money. The reason being, right now, debt payment is the largest ministry, department, and agency of the national government. If you think about the amount of money we are spending, 1.85 billion. But lastly, let us address, and this is to you, the question of pending bills. Particularly, not only pending bills to private sector, which is really, I mean, we're talking about 700 billion right now, but also pending bills of government institutions that are not remitting statutory deductions. The control of budget has raised that matter, that when you finally get to hospital, in fact, the NHIF remittances are the ones that are highest, I think 155 billion. None, which means this is money that has been deducted from an employee, but has not been remitted to KRA, or has not been remitted to NHIF, has not, because that has a multiplier effect in terms of the good of the workers that we are talking about, the good of the economy that we are speaking about, and by not paying pending bills, what we are doing is that then we are decentivizing private sector activity. Enterprise, because we are saying it doesn't make sense, people are being auctioned. It doesn't make sense for me to work so hard to provide a service, a good or a works, to government, which is still the largest consumer, if you think about it in the economy, yet I will not get paid, or I will have to wait. And when you combine the counties and the national government, you're looking almost $1 trillion, in pending bills, or thereabout. Because those are the things, because we need to see, as you said, the totality of the budget and how it facilitates different players into the future.
I will take those as your final comments. With the summary, now your final comments.
Yvonne, I also want to respond to some of the issues raised by yourself and Dr. Rugo. Number one is the issue of supplementaries. Dr. Rugo is a PhD in economics. And if I was in your seat, unfortunately, we are on the same side, I can't ask him questions. What is the other route of aligning a budget that was made for payment of interest rate when the dollar was exchanging to Kenya shillings 180 shillings to USD, to when you are closing the financial year when the dollar is exchanging to 130 shillings? Why am I saying that? All the monies the government spent have to be budgeted. Either at Article 223 spend then regulate, approve later, or actually before. Then, Dr. Rugo, that gives you, or gives us all here the reason why, for example, this supplementary is very important. That yes, we were to pay interest rate when the dollar was 180. The interest rates are the same in dollar terms, but then our budget is made in Kenya shillings. So some of these things, there is no way you can escape. Secondly, we are not talking about a month. The last supplementary we made was close of 2023, when the dynamics of everything, dynamics on interest rates was different, dynamics on exchange rate was different, and those are the only two parameters that then dictate the amount of money you end up spending on debt service. So primarily, some of these issues are unavoidable. Secondly, from where I sit, all of us here should be celebrating, Yvonne, that the share of agriculture as a share of GDP has actually come down from 25 to 19. It is a very good thing, by the way. Economically speaking, every economy that hedges its progress on being an agrarian economy, then exposes yourself to all manner of vagaries. And if you put...
But do we see a corresponding increase in contribution of manufacturing to the GDP?
In fact,
that has remained constant.
In fact, that is what I'm answering. So, composition, so that I give it into context in terms of manufacturing also. And I also, it's good for us to look at beyond Kenya. Look at the US. I'm coming close home.
Let's talk about Kenya first.
Yvonne, I'm coming there. Comparisons are very important. But you can't look at you. No, please. Let me just make my point the way I know how.
All right.
So US is not an agrarian economy. I mean, the welfare of the people there is clearly higher than Kenya. Is China an agrarian economy? Yes, it was. Is it now? No. Is South Korea an agrarian economy? No. So moving away in terms of decimating agriculture as a share of GDP is actually a measure of progress. Then how is it? As the economy of Kenya has climbed down from 25% as a share of GDP in terms of and agriculture we talk about now, agriculture itself, mining and forestry, everything that is primary production. The second one is manufacturing. Whereas agriculture now is around 18%, industry is around 19% or thereabout. Both combined, actually one is 18, the other one is 17. Both combined is 35%. Then, as agriculture climbs down, what has been taking its share? It is the service industry. The service industry in Kenya now accounts for 65% of our GDP. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It is a good thing. Why? Agriculture as an aggregate is growing. Yvonne, I hope you get that. Agriculture in terms of a quantum is growing. What is shrinking is the agriculture as a share of GDP. Why is that good? It is good because agriculture in Kenya and elsewhere, majority of it is dependent on several things. One, vagaries of weather. Two, diminishing returns. Agriculture across the world is one of the items of diminishing returns. When you farm 1,000 bags, as you farm another 1,000, you spend much more cost. It is not stable. Economies that are stable are the ones that are not exposed to agrarianism. They are the ones that are exposed to two things, service and industry.
Okay.
Kenya is predominantly service, and the more it will continue to be more stable as we grow service and industry as a share of GDP. Okay. So it is a good thing, and I am happy that we are progressing towards that.
Well, we're still not seeing the corresponding, because as you would see a decrease in one, you would see a decrease in another. I would like to your final comments now. You have spoken some heavy English for my viewers today. I pray that your closing comments might be a little simpler for us to all have a take home.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. It has been a very pleasant place here and show. Forgive us when sometimes we can't avoid some of the economic jargons, because there could not be many other substitutes for the same. But all the same, I hope we have made the point. And I want to appreciate the Kenyan people for the opportunity to serve them. We are always grateful. And we are doing our best to make sure that our country becomes better today, tomorrow, and in the future. And that is why sometimes some of the things that are proposed could be painful now, but as years come on, then we appreciate that they were meant for the benefit of a stable economy. And do you assure them that their views will be heard? Kenyans are a little skeptical about that throughout the public participation process. I assure all Kenyans there are two very critical things that are happening. One is the finance bill, which will become an act. And number two is now the appropriations. I mean, the estimates that we are considering. Yep. The budget we make is for the Kenyan people. Last week, I was in Madeira County, listening to the people of Madeira. We had many teams from the budget committee visiting various counties in Kenya, taking views of Kenyans. My colleague, Honorable Kimani Kuria, has already started the process. We'll be going to the people to seek guidance in terms of the finance bill. As it happened in the year 2023, I want to assure the Kenyan people we are a democratic country. We listen to Kenyans, and it is never in vain or just for formality. All their views makes us more wiser. And I appreciate even this kind of show. And as I had asked you, Yvonne, earlier, you'll give me even the feedback of Kenyans so that we align our thinking towards the aspirations of our bosses, who are the people of Kenya. Asante sana.
Thank you very much. Honorable Ndindi Nyoro is the chair of the Budget and Appropriations Committee at the National Assembly, and Dr. Abraham Rugo, who's the country manager of IBP Kenya. Gentlemen, thank you. We hope you will come again, because we need to discuss this a lot more, particularly within the next month or so. Thank you very much for your time here this evening. Let's take a break on the program. We come back. We've got to update you with more news of the day, so stay with us. This is The Explainer, and also keep your feedback coming. We shall definitely relay that back to you, and of course share that with the chair of the Budget Committee. Let's take a break. Explainer.